Representative Garner, I wanted to frame today's discussion as just sort of, so the governor's big reform bill, House Bill or Senate Bill 294, the Arkansas Learns Act, which we view as really a voucher bill with a little bit of education in it rather than an education bill.
Right.
And it passed, I think, as most of our viewers probably know, through the House yesterday. And so I wonder if you just walk us through sort of the technical next steps for the bill itself, and then for the three of us to have conversation about kind of what's next for those of us in the public education advocacy space to do.
Right. You know, so the bill passed yesterday in the House. It still has amendments that have to be added back to the Senate. The Senate passed it first, and so with some promises that some amendments would be made. As many of you may know, a lot of us sent in both technical and, both technical and amendments that would, substantive, but certainly amendments that would have changed a lot of things in the bill. And even the technical changes that we asked for were not made. So the substantive certainly weren't. So anyway, I'm not really sure what all amendments they're going to add, but they will add, they added some that they put into the bill. And then there were some promises for some more amendments to be added to the Senate side. And I don't know whether those will be added or whether they'll just have to vote on the bill as it is. We were not consulted, the Democrats were not consulted about that. So it'll go back to the Senate. It'll go back to the Senate for the amendment to be voted on, and then the entire bill will be voted on. So on the Senate floor. So that's the next step. And then after that, we had enough votes for the emergency clause, so on the House side. So if the Senate has enough votes, 2/3 vote, then the bill will be sent to the governor will sign it, and then it goes through the rules process. And as anyone who listened to any of the testimony heard, boy, a large percentage of the details are going to have to be ironed out in rules. And generally, rules can take up to 2 years. And
rules are going to be at the State Board of Education, right?
Right. And then they will have to come to the Rules Committee to be voted on.
Right.
So the legislature has one more shot to deal with that. And before the rules come back to the legislature, they have to have public comment. So we do have another opportunity to get in our comments, and I would suggest to follow that process, and it has to be advertised, and they have to get public comment. So, and then the legislature, they will combine all that, all the information they get from the public comment and bring that to the legislature, and we will have an opportunity to hear that before voting.
So, we had so many parents and educators and just community members saying, really substantive concerns about the bill. Some of the administrators are pointing out the math doesn't add up, or the rules sometimes are going to cause conflicts that were unforeseen. All that they're saying are going to be dealt with in rulemaking. So that's going to be really critical for the public to stay engaged as this kind of continues to be made into the final sausage, so to speak.
And I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't have some lawsuits in the meantime. So, we'll see how that.
There's a flurry of discussion for sure.
Yes. So we'll see how that turns out. Yeah.
We'll see. I would be shocked if there's not some litigation filed.
Me too.
By some entities. Representative Garner, if they amend it further in the Senate than it has been already in the House, won't it have to come back to the House?
Yes, it would. Well, it would. But my guess is they're going to do exactly what they've done so far and just promise to do anything that the House asked in rules. So if they don't add any amendments, then it will not have to come back to the House. It's done.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've never seen a bill pass where the legislator said, I don't like parts of this bill, and the sponsor said, well, we'll fix that part after it passes. Is just
Right.
strikes me as really unusual.
It absolutely, it hasn't happened that way as long as I've been there, the 5 years I've been there. So certainly not substantive issues. It's been a long 2 weeks.
It's been a long 2 weeks. You probably had less sleep than me, and that's not much. So I'm sure it's been a long 2 weeks.
It has been a long 2 weeks, but anyway, yes, any substantive changes are generally done in the committee, in the regular process through the committee, and then voted on in the House. So, and then the Senate, that same way in the Senate. So nothing has been done like this since I've been there.
Do you know, I know several senators asked for amendments as well. And again, the amendments, I agree with you, it seemed like they ignored a lot, even of technical correction.
Right.
And then very little of substance was changed. Do you know if the senators that asked for amendments, are they satisfied to your knowledge?
I think they've been promised everything will be taken care of in the rules process. So I can't imagine they are, but because Senator Hammer, I know, had, even his technical issues were not taken care of. So I'm surprised, really, that they're not going to go.
Senator Hammer as someone who's very cautious and what's the right word? Studious about what he wants.
Yes, he is.
I would not want to mess with him.
No, I wouldn't either.
Our politics aren't always in line, but I sure appreciate the rigor that he brings to.
He does. He absolutely does. And I think he likes most of the concept of the bill. I think he just had some real issues in the bill making process and the technical pieces of the bill. There's some places that don't make sense. There are terms that aren't defined. That's just not very good practice to be voting on a bill like that.
Right. One of the things that I was, one last question, and especially I promise we're going to bring you the conversation, but one of the things that I was also just the most disappointed about was, so on the Senate, the sponsor promised to talk with stakeholders and get some suggested amendments. And we reached out to Senator Davis multiple times between when it left the Senate and got to the House, and never really connect other than brief exchanges. And then on the House side, we had several members of the committee asking, what would you suggest to improve it? And, we made several recommendations, but many others did as well. And some of our suggestions were on parts of the bill that we even liked, but that could be done better. And as far as I can tell, all that fell on deaf ears.
I talked to the sponsors of the bill before Friday and said, I have not even had a chance to talk to my stakeholders. I had meetings set up with all of the co-op superintendents and then a couple of teachers meetings and a couple of principal meetings over the weekend, because we just didn't have an opportunity to do that once we got the bill on Monday. So anyway, I had asked him if I could just have till Sunday night to send in our suggestions or their suggestions for any amendments. And the bill was, they had taken the amendments that the Senate had given, and we had actually sent in, and I say Vivian and Tippy and I got together and we had some amendments that we did go ahead and send in early. So we sent them in Friday afternoon, but when he told us to send them, but he had told me that, Sunday night would be fine and they'd still have an opportunity to engross some of those amendments. And the bill was engrossed on Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock or 4:30 or something, long before he told us that he would look over our amendments. So, it's a little disingenuous, I think, to say that you'll listen to stakeholders and then not do anything after the bill's been filed and engrossed. And I don't expect that to happen. I think they'll send the bill as engrossed to the Senate, go through the committee, and then the Senate floor, and promise that any changes that need to be made will be made in rules and future legislation.
Rules can't override what you guys say.
Right.
So there's going to have to be, I think, a lot
And
of.
the bill doesn't say it doesn't say everything succinct. So, I think there's going to be lots of questions about even the things that we agree on. I think there are going to be lots of questions about definitions and implementation, just the logistics of implementation are going to be interesting. Combining the early childhood department under special ed, under Department of Ed is going to be an interesting process, and it's going to take longer than 6 weeks. So we'll see. We're watching closely.
So
we're resting this weekend. And then we get back at it Monday.
You burned a little rest. So let's move away from the process for a minute and talk a little bit about the substance. So especially you came down to testify on the crazy House hearing day. And I know you had some specific concerns. So do you want to just tell everybody a little bit about your background and then kind of, I think you have a lot of expertise in some of these areas, and then maybe just highlight a couple of the concerns that you had about the bill.
Yeah, definitely. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Bill, for the opportunity, and Representative Garner, thank you for being in our corner. I am a lifelong Arkansan, and I have lived in Southeast Arkansas all of my life. So, many of us consider that to be the Delta region of the state. And so I began my career in education as an English as a second language paraprofessional. And so I did that for 5 years, and I took a break in between then, and I went back to education, and I was a high school English teacher after that, and I'm currently a literacy specialist. And so during that time, I had a son. He's 4 years old. He'll be turning 5 next month, so he'll be starting kindergarten in the fall. When he was, just to tell you a little bit more about our family situation, when he was 2 years old, he stopped speaking, which was, right in the middle of the pandemic. And through our, great pediatrician, we found out later that he is autistic. He stopped speaking from about age 2 to age 4. Now that he's 4, he's talking again. But
recording in progress.
But he has significant special needs. And that is kind of where my concern lied as far as my personal family is considered, that I felt like the special education teachers and students are being left out of this legislation. And I know there were several parents that went to both the Senate Education Committee and the House Education Committee hearings. And a lot of us kind of feel like, our concerns fell on deaf ears. And personally, I feel like sometimes in certain situations, people make it seem as if we should be happy that our children are just in the building in the first place. And so that's kind of what I'm concerned about, specifically his literacy needs. I have training as under RISE. I've taken all of the trainings that the state has to offer, and I'm also a K2 RISE trainer. And so I don't feel like the training as it has been currently given to teachers addresses the needs of students who aren't able to communicate with their teachers. And so one of the things I would ask from my educator hat, taking off my parent hat a little bit and putting on my educator hat, is that there's something in the legislation to account for children and students that are nonverbal. Specifically giving special education teachers and students the tools that they need so that, by the time they get to that 3rd grade, if that's the mark that we're setting, that they are able to successfully take all of those assessments and pass, because I don't just want him to be able to go to school and form those great relationships with his peers. I want him to actually be educated. I want him to be a literate person. And so those are kind of where my concerns lie. Do you have any other areas you'd like for me to address, Bill or Representative Garner?
Well, we might talk about some other areas and just have some back and forth discussion. But before we get there, first of all, thank you, and thank you for all that you do for trying to improve education in our community. And just let me pause for a second. So you're watching our Friday webinar series with the Arkansas Public Policy Panel and the Citizens First Congress, a little station identification there. And if you have questions, we have folks watching us on Facebook Live or on the Zoom. If you have questions, put them in the chat for the Zoom or put them in the comment section on the Facebook Live. We started, if you're coming in late, just talking about the process of sort of where we are with the bill. Now that it's passed the House, what does Representative Garner expect next of the bill, which is largely passage through the Senate, and then on to a very important rulemaking process. And so we're going to need a lot of public engagement on the rulemaking. And part of the point of rulemaking and frankly the testimony is also building a record, because we do know that there are people considering a lawsuit. And so that gets me to a question, Representative Garner. Someone asked in the I think the Facebook stream is, if someone were going to file a lawsuit to try to stop implementation of this bill, do you have any sense of the timing when that would need to be? I'm not a lawyer, I don't have a clue.
Yeah, I'm not either, but I can tell you that when I got so frustrated about, usually we tell people to contact their legislators. And in this case, the legislators are doing exactly what the governor wants them to do. I think they're afraid of her money and the potential that she can primary, and she will primary them if they don't vote the way she wants them to vote. I think they're extremely afraid of that. And there were several that did not vote their hearts because of that. So I think I got frustrated with that. Obviously, people were contacting the Democrats who were already on board with the bill. So I started telling people to contact the governor's office. And when that didn't work, I started telling them to donate to the ACLU and to the Public Policy Panel and to those folks, to Arkansas Advocates, to some of those folks who are pulling the research and then will be the ones to actually work on those lawsuits. I don't know how long it will take. I think we could check with ACLU with some of the folks there, or Tom Mars may be out there looking at a way to do some of that. Obviously, school districts can form a class action, or groups can form a class action suit. I really am, like Special, worried about the special needs population, whether we're talking about physical or emotional or intellectual. So, I'm really concerned with that population, and there's no reason they could not pull together a class action suit. And I think we'll see that. I think we've set ourselves up for another Lakeview.
Yeah. So one question that I have for you, Representative Garner, is so the bill is staggering for what it doesn't include in a so-called education bill, and special education is a huge area that's been sort of left to the side. Pre-K and after school programs remain without any funding increase. Actually, Arkansas doesn't spend any state funding on after school or summer programs at all. Right. And then, we heard from time and again in all the testimony and all the research, even before the testimony, that poverty is the biggest driver of low student performance. Arkansas is at the top, sadly, in child poverty, and the bill is completely silent on that.
Right.
I heard a lot of legislators, particularly in the Education Committee, say, well, we're just going to pass this bill, and it doesn't mean we don't support pre-K or support all these other things that you experts are saying we need to do, and we still have time during the session to address some of that. And frankly, I got frustrated because I've heard that shtick for 10, 15 years and not seen, because all the money is being poured into the voucher scheme and the charter expansion, that there's just hasn't.
Yeah, she's still talking about tax cuts.
Right, and well, yeah, and then every governor loves them some tax cuts, which again is fine if we're meeting all of our constitutional obligations to quality education.
Which we're not.
And so the question that I have is, are the members of the House Education Committee that said, hey, we still have time to address some of these things that aren't in the bill? I mean, is that genuine? Like, should folks be contacting their legislators with ideas about, we think you should fund, pre-K or after school or special education or whatnot? Do you think the members are serious about attempting to address some of the shortcomings of the bill?
Absolutely. I think the more we can contact them, the more they we wear them out. So yes, I do think we need to do that. In my comments with some of the governor's staff, I've not met the governor yet, but with her staff and with some of the Republicans, when I talk about pre-K, and my passion is 0 to 3, and I don't think we're not doing enough for 4 and 5, but we're not doing anything for 0 to 3. And when I talk about when 85% of your brain is developed, so when I talked about that, they said that's why we're combining, so that we can study what we need to do for early childhood. And when I asked about studies for the voucher program, they gave me a literature review from the Heritage Foundation that when you tap on the links, it goes to the author's book. It's frustrating because we're doing something that has zero statistical significance when we're talking about student learning, and yet they want to spend a couple of years pulling the department together and figuring out what we're doing and what we're not doing, and take time to develop a system so that we're doing it right. That's pretty hypocritical.
You gave me an excellent opportunity to plug something. So at the panel back in 2007, we commissioned a report from Dr. Jay Barth and Dr. Keith Nita to look at the evidence around what actually improves student performance. And way back then, they found statistical significance, as you're saying, for after school and summer, pre-K, improving teacher quality, providing wraparound services, community schools. And they found no statistical significance around charter schools, vouchers. And frankly, the data has only gotten worse since 2007 as states have done voucher experiments. Now,
20 years now.
Starting to see that they're having negative impacts instead of null impacts.
Exactly.
And but your point is in terms of all the things missing from the bill, you think that those of us out in the community need to keep the pressure on our lawmakers?
Yeah. Yes, certainly. I think the more we can keep the pressure on, the more they get tired and just will do it. So I'm hoping there'll be enough pressure to do some things. We've tried, and maybe it was too early, but we tried a bill for, and Wooten was running it, Representative Wooten, who's a Republican, one of the 4 Republicans that voted against the bill.
He said yesterday that this vote will haunt his colleagues. I mean, that was pretty stark.
Yes. And he believes that, as I do, and he's safe enough to say it, I guess. But anyway, I think that we can still work on accountability, the accountability pieces. I think we can work on some things to try to make this bill a little bit better, to make sure that there's accountability in public schools and home schools, that the testing is such that we're using the same test so that we're comparing apples to apples, and those kinds of things. I don't think there's any way we can get anything substantive through, like after school and summer programs. I'm certainly willing to try, and I know the Democrats are going to try, but we've got to have Republican support before we can do any of that.
Well, I think the reality is the money's not there in the budget because they just spent a lot.
Exactly. Money's not there. And we're getting ready to deplete the budget in significant ways that, like I said, have zero statistical significance. So
I had a quick question. Since you mentioned the testing, as you know, most of the educators know that are in public schools or public charter schools. This is supposed to be the last year for the ACT, Aspire, as the test. So has there been any indication of what we can expect coming? And since, I guess you could say our opposition keeps telling us that that's the measure, that we'll be able to measure the success of everything through the testing, which, we know that one test that you take one day shouldn't define you as a student. And I believe that as an educator. So just if you could kind of speak to that.
I'll be glad to tell you what I've heard. But this is all I've heard. I know that there's a group of folks working on testing and looking at, working with the company to try to figure out the testing for DESE. What I've heard is they're looking at grade normative tests, which, you know, help us in that grade, at that grade level, but it's still, grade normative tests still leave out those folks who are not at the grade level yet, and those folks that are above the grade level. So it's leaving out a whole lot of folks that are not right in the middle. And so, you know, I'm concerned about that and kind of waiting to hear the report. I've certainly talked to some of the folks that are on that committee through the co-ops, and that's where I get a lot of my information, is through our regional co-ops. So I am concerned about that, but you see in the bill that we don't right now, and they keep telling me in the rules we can do this, that we are not using the same national test to compare homeschool and charter schools and private schools. They can use their own test. Even taking public money, they can use whatever test they want. So there's no way to compare. You know, I know Bill and I've talked about this before, but we have years of data now for charter school, or we should have years of data for charter schools. Yeah, but right now we're not comparing apples to apples, because they can choose their own students. They can send away anybody they want to, folks that can't afford transportation or food, or and they're not testing in the same way. So, you know, all of those things are difficult to monitor if we don't have that same data. And I think if anybody who's taking public funds ought to have to take the same test, so that we can at least see where our tax money is going, make sure that the kids are getting what they need and they're learning, whatever learning environment.
The Secretary Olivia said that the tests that they're using are comparable because they're norm referenced. That what most education researchers have said is that that's still insufficient to actually make the academic comparisons.
Right.
So we really do need the same test. And that leads, so Maria on Facebook asked a question I want to share with both of you and see if one of you want to take a stab at it. Do you think that when contacting our legislators that I should say that they shouldn't give money to schools that aren't required to follow an IEP or a 504 plan for students with special needs? Is that an effective message to lawmakers?
Well, effective, I'm not sure, because it's one that I've been suggesting for a long time. I think if we have more parents that have IEPs start contacting their own legislators, yes, I do think that's something that's very important. And we have a responsibility to every single child, and we need to know that they're getting everything that they need. And Special, you may be able to talk about this a little bit more, but there's some ramifications for special needs children if they are not in a public system and they go into a private school. They have no recourse. Is that?
So I think you're referring to the IDEA,
It's part of the IDEA.
So. Students that are in public schools, they have an IEP, that's an individual education program, or a 504 plan. 504 are usually related to health issues, but anyway, so public schools have to meet that because that's a federal mandate. Right. Whereas sometimes, most of the time, when they get into private institutions, then that federal protection is no longer there. Right. That's my understanding and the research that I've done. And so in my situation, of course, that concerns me. However, I know I may be jumping a little bit ahead, Bill, but I live in a community that doesn't have charter schools, nor does it have private schools anyway. So my child has to choose between one public school or another public school because we live in Monticello. So those types of, this whole choice that they're given is not being realistic for those of us that live in a Delta or a small rural community.
And I think a really important point on that is that, so if your child attends a traditional public school, that school district is legally required to spend enough money to meet the needs educational needs of your child, regardless of what that is. So it could be $20,000 or $30,000. I mean, some children with special needs need a lot of support. If you instead go to a charter school, or if you take your voucher to go to a private school, they have the $7,000 that came with the voucher, and that's all they're required to spend. And even if your child needs $30,000 worth of support, that school is under no legal obligation to provide it. And I think a lot of parents don't realize that. But one of the things,
just quickly, I just wanted to say, and what happens sometimes in the charter system, that they'll have that conversation with the family to say, like, this is the extent of what we can provide, and maybe our school is not right for your family. Right. And which is kind of the same conversation that happens in private institutions as well.
Well, and so Representative Garner, we're making a list of suggested kind of follow-up legislation, and one of those pieces is would be a requirement of any school accepting public dollars to disclose what waivers from state standards they have.
Oh, I love that.
Because we've had a lot of parents sign their child up at a charter school, only to find out later that the charter school didn't have a certified special education teacher anywhere on the faculty. And that kind of stuff. If we're going to talk about empowering parents to make good choices, and parents should have the information.
Absolutely.
To truly compare apples to apples, as you'd say.
And that's been the argument forever for grading schools, public schools, is so that the parents know what they're getting. And it's an awful way. I hate grades, and it's an awful way to determine what's happening in your school. However, the argument goes both directions. Yeah, parents should know exactly what they're getting in private school and public charter schools, or parochial schools for that matter. They've got to know. But we heard testimony of private schools saying, we meet with the parents and tell them what we can do, and we let them know if they can't meet the needs of their children. And that's exactly the way they keep anyone with any special needs out. I will say too that one of the other things that's been mentioned over and over again, besides the rules process, is that we're going to fix the matrix. Yeah. And in the 5 years, so I've gone through 2 adequacy studies. We spend 2 years on adequacy, which is another thing. We spend 2 years on adequacy, but we've pushed this bill through, and
just so everybody knows, adequacy is a process the legislature uses to make sure they're meeting the court mandate of providing an adequate education. And so every 2 years, the legislative committee does a study to look at how much more funding they need to put into the state funding formula that provides state dollars to every school to meet the needs of children. And what we've seen is over the past 8 years, kind of a lowballing of adequacy needs so that they can fund tax cuts and vouchers and charter schools and whatnot. So
right, I think you mentioned in testimony that when we right after the Blue Ribbon Commission, after Lakeview, when we put the money into adequacy, when we took care of some of those needs that resources that schools needed, our scores went way up. It was only when we stopped funding adequacy that our grades started, that our testing scores, our student learning went down. So the other thing that folks are talking about is fixing adequacy. And I do think that that's when you need to be talking to the education committee, and as opposed to just your legislature. So you need to be talking to the House and Senate education committees. They're the ones that do the adequacy studies. And we spend 2 days a week out of session, at least 2 days a week out of session doing that. So that's what we'll be doing after session ends, is working on that adequacy study. And we know a lot of the things that are wrong, but they've actually said we're going to fix them in adequacy, and we need to hold them to that. And one of those is special needs. And Bill, you may have the exact numbers, but I think we spent less than $200, or that we funded less than $200 worth of special needs funding. And then the school system spent over $500 per child in the adequacy report. So we're way underfunding And we have been way underfunding special.
And even the 500 wasn't sufficient. So I was going to actually, you just teed me up perfectly. I was going to ask special. So you have a special needs child and you're in a school with students with special needs. Do you think the state is supporting special needs students enough? And what is, I'm kind of asking you a loaded question, but, or leading question at least, but talk to us from your perspective about what the state needs to be investing in special education, because it's a giant problem in the state.
So my son currently attends a public pre-K for students that have developmental disabilities. And because of that type of facilities, he's getting everything that he needs. He's getting everything that's in his IEP. So in that type of environment, and also most of the kids, all of the kids that attend there, they have to be qualified, whether it's regular Medicaid or the state funded Medicaid programs for individuals with disabilities. So he's able to get everything there. However, if he was maybe possibly in another public daycare, that may or may not be happening. And so that is where we need to spend more money, even like Representative Garner has said, for the 0 to 3 and even a little more for 4 and 5-year-olds, because they're not getting what they need. And I can speak to personally when we lost, people have been getting dropped from the Medicaid rolls. And so I had to switch from one program to another program. And during that time, he had to go back to a public facility that wasn't as controlled as the one he's in. And so we were having a hard time then getting those services that he needs, like occupational therapy and speech therapy. So that's, we experienced that a little bit. And then from my teacher purview, for example, when I'm teaching high school classes, there have been times where you have a certain amount of students that are called inclusion students. So they have IEPs, but they're able to come into your classroom. And so that is where we need the money for the support staff, because sometimes I didn't have the adequate support staff to help me when I was over my limit for students that had disabilities that were in my classroom. And so that makes it difficult for me to meet their needs and the needs of the other students that are in my classroom. So if I could ask for anything as an educator, definitely we need more funding for special education students, no matter their age, whether they're as young as my child or older students in high school and middle school as well. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you did. And again, so Representative Garner, one of the things that I found the most frustrating about the very limited public engagement and debate we had on the bill was, so several years ago, I think it was 2017, may have been 15, it's been a minute, the state had a task force on special education, special needs kids, and it found that the state, I think it was $100 million of immediate crisis dollars needed, and wow, that the legislature never really provided, and then the needs to actually get to something you'd call an adequate education for special needs kids was even larger. So I'll try to find that report for you. But I'd love to see it, yeah. But the legislature, one of the things that I found frustrating is so many different education groups have released recommendations that are evidence-based. And we didn't see any of that, even in the discussion, when, some groups like ours tried to even bring it into the discussion. I saw some of the lawmakers in the education committee smirking during our testimony or during the testimony of other experts, because they'd already made up their minds. And I just found that really frustrating, because, the School Administrators Association have released a set of recommendations. Forward Arkansas has a set of recommendations. And all those recommendations, there's little differences between them, but generally they follow the evidence, and there's an awful lot of alignment. And so I don't know, as we're going forward, should we be starting to just file bills on some of where the research does say we can make a difference, so we can at least have the debate about what's not being done that the evidence says we ought to do?
Absolutely. And I'm taking notes as we're talking here to see what all we need to be doing. And I'm certainly willing to try to file anything. And like I said, we can file whatever we want to. We can try to present anything we want to in the committee, as long as the chairman will hear it. And like I said, we meet 2 to 3 days, 2 days, sometimes more, to meet with the education committee, 2 to 3 days a month, to meet with the education subcommittee to work on adequacy. And that's the time when we could do some of these interim studies and at least get the discussion going. So we can start the discussion now and then pull in the experts to talk about some of these things at the beginning of those adequacy meetings, and maybe we'll make some headway. You know,
yeah, that would be one thing we could try to get is at least a commitment to hold a series of interim hearings.
Yes.
So we can highlight not only what should be being done, but also what the problems because I mean, this bill, you heard from educator after educator, this bill is going to have massive problems as they roll it out, even on the stuff that people want to work well because it's so poorly written.
Where are we going to find 120 literacy coaches?
Right. So one thing I want to plug real quick. So at the Citizens First Congress, we made a 14-page sort of set of recommendations on the bill that breaks it down section by section. And we gave it to lawmakers, but you can find it on our website if you're looking for a summary. Lots of other groups made them, and theirs are great resources as well. But ours, I know where it is. It's at citizensfirst.org. So you might check that out if you're interested in seeing kind of a section by section breakdown. And we flag this is not evidence-based support strategy, and we flag where this does have strong evidence to support it. And what we found that was also disappointing is a lot of the evidence-based things are only partially funded, and in a lot of cases funded partially in ways that require local matches or competitive that are going to, I think, expand the disparity between high wealth, low wealth districts instead of we really should be focused. Equity is also in the Constitution, although a lot of our lawmakers try to ignore that clause. So that's helpful. So there's a lot to come. And basically what I hear is that we need to continue advocating for what we think should be in education reform.
Absolutely. And you have my cell phone number is on the website. Y'all text me, email me, let me know what you want me to talk about. And I'm glad to do that. Hopefully we can find a few Republican colleagues of yours willing to work with us. I mean, this has always been it's not even been bipartisan. It's just been nonpartisan. Exactly. And it should be. We don't have our subcommittees yet, but that's also a good way to bring in specific specialists on a variety of things. There'll be an early childhood committee, and there'll be a higher ed and a K-12 committee. So subcommittee. So those subcommittees are also good ways to try to bring in some experts to talk. They can meet as well, and we do frequently. So.
Okay, so we got just a few more minutes. I want to remind everybody, this is your last chance. If you have questions, you can put it in the chat on Facebook, or if you're watching us on Zoom, you can put it in the chat on Zoom. And as we close out, I'd like to focus in on maybe have each of us talk about one thing. If we could just change one thing in the bill that would be realistic, that's, not undo the vouchers or something, but one thing, what would the one thing that you would change that would be the most important to you? And Special, can I start with you, or do you need a second? Because I can start. I got my one thing. So if you need a minute, I can start. But if you got yours, go for it.
I don't have mine. I'm still thinking if you'll go ahead and give me a little.
I'll start with my, I think one thing that would make particularly the voucher part a lot better is, so several years ago, a group of researchers got together and made a suggestion to the State Department of Education that they start disaggregating student IDs from their test score data so we can track that test data over time, called longitudinal tracking. And what that would allow us to do is it allow us to see if a student goes from a public school to a private school or a charter school, it would let us see in real numbers whether their student performance increases, decreases, or whatnot, but it would still protect the privacy of the student so that we're not, we don't get special Sanders test scores. We get the test scores of student, with some student number attached to it. And it seems like if we had that data, we could answer conclusively, is the program working or not working, instead of having an ideological fight about it. It seems like some people want to have an ideological fight instead of actually looking at evidence. But it just seems like a reasonable thing we ought to be able to do so we can actually at least measure. Clearly the majority of the legislature wants to do this program. We ought to at least have the ability to measure how it works as they do it. So I have a lot of things, but that's one thing that I think would be really important.
And that's actually what I was, not specifically, but I think the accountability piece, I really am not particular so much about where the kids get a good education, if they're getting a good education. Obviously, I'm a public school advocate, and I think our tax dollars need to go to public schools. But we have an obligation to make sure that every child in Arkansas has a good education, and that equity piece is part of it. So the accountability piece to me is just absolutely necessary. And like I said, I think we will try to bring Senator Wooten's bill back. I think we're looking at some transportation and some other things. I love the idea of just the knowledge of the waivers that each program, I love that idea. I think that's something that we should do now.
I will email you as soon as
there,
we're
there
on.
you go. There you go. I think we've got to do that. But we have had, I do think that pulling together the departments to work on the software and hardware we need to gather that data and to make those changes, I think that will happen more easily with early childhood, with DESE, with elementary and secondary education. I hope that's the case. We've talked to GIF. I'm also on the Advanced Technology Committee, and so we've talked with the GIF folks about and technology folks about trying to make sure that we're getting that done. So I'm hoping that that'll be something that we can do. But I love that idea, because we have to get the data to know what we're doing, and we don't know. We've got charter schools with failing grades, D's and F's. So we've got to make sure that every child is getting a good education, and we can't know that if we don't know what's happening in that school, and we don't have a good way to measure the growth rate in each one of those schools in a way that's comparable.
Okay, and I think kind of piggybacking off of what you have both spoken to, I think in education right now, we know that the biggest issue is literacy. And I just think that I've read through the parts about the Right to Read Act, and I, as a teacher, I've experienced the training that's necessary. So I think, and I love the idea about the literacy coaches statewide, but and this dyslexia part of it as well, because I think students in Arkansas are they're not being identified. And so sometimes that contributes to some issues later on as they're matriculating through the K-12 system. So I think the thing I would think that we would need to look more closely at is the capacity of the department to monitor all of the schools. So if we're going to look at literacy, take a deep dive on every campus to make sure that we're achieving those. I don't know, I don't have the proper words right now to use, but I think if we could create a system where we're actively monitoring, which is what I think the bill is proposing to do in regards to literacy, by taking out some exams. But I will say we already have, tests that we're using that are giving us the same data points. Like we have the department, you can use Curriculum Associates, DIBELS, and NWAs. But what I've learned as a literacy specialist, that sometimes if the child is behind in literacy, all three of those assessments are going to tell you the same thing. The data is going to line up. So we need to make sure that all schools are using those, or pick one, and then everybody uses it, so that we can all have the same data, which will go back to what you were saying, Bill. So we'll have this data that's going to follow students, and then we understand what their needs are. And then I think that would support the literacy coaches that would be coming in. But in my opinion, we're going to need more than 120. That's just my opinion. So thank you.
Right. Thank you for highlighting that. Those are three good things. So we have one last question in the chat, and then I'm going to kind of leave with a summary of what I think our next steps that I've pulled from this are. So the question, though, is from Anna Huff Davis. And first of all, Anna, it's been a long time since I've seen you. It's really good to see your name on my screen. And the question is, school consolidation. What are your thoughts about the likelihood of this bill causing more of that? I'm from Marble Elaine School District, which is the only district currently slated for consolidation. And we heard a lot of concerns about schools that are near the minimum number threshold, schools that are in academic distress, and really schools that are in fiscal distress, all being pushed over the edge and being consolidated either with private entities, which is concerning in its own way, or with nearby school districts. So Representative Garner, can you talk about kind of the way you see the impacts of this bill and happening with school consolidation?
Well, we have one of our senators has proposed a bill to keep consolidation from happening. My fear is that, but in the first place, I don't think it can pass. But if we say no consolidation, that the only option is to close, or to sell out to a charter or to a pop-up parochial. So I'm extremely concerned about consolidation. We've seen what happens in Marble and Elaine, and the public schools are the community in so many of these smaller towns, and so we've got to protect the public schools as much as we can. But I'm concerned about it as well. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Nobody could tell us it wouldn't happen.
Again, keep the pressure on our lawmakers to make sure that we don't drive that. And we got another question in, so we're just, and I think we have time to do this one. So Elaine Williams, who's another great educator from down in Prescott, Arkansas, asks, how will the literacy coaches be selected and what schools will have access to the coaches? It's all in the rulemaking, right? We don't know.
Well, that's right. That's right. You know, the school board and DESE and the attorneys at BLR will all get together and try to figure out all these rules, and then they'll come to the legislature. But we won't see them until they come through the acceptance piece of that part of it. So you guys may see. I mean, we will see them at the same time that public comment is made, and I would guess they're going to have to start that fairly quickly, because they did pass the emergency clause.
I mean, that was one of Senator Hammer's concerns, is there's 2 to 10 years of rulemaking in this bill.
That's right.
But with the emergency clause, it all has to be done instantaneously. So one concern that I have is that some of it may be rushed and shoddy.
Exactly, like as the bill was.
Right. Okay, so that's getting us to an end. So here's what I want to try to summarize. So first of all, I want to thank you, Special and Representative Garner, for giving us your time and for all the advocacy that both of you do all the time. You're both heroes, and so thank you very much. The summary that I hear is that one of the big next steps is, now that the bill seems it's going to likely pass the Senate next week, by a vote similar to what it cleared last week through the Senate. So rulemaking, that whole rulemaking process the Department of Ed and the State Board are going to start is going to be really critical for us to keep an eye on, make sure we're giving them public input on that, and really holding their feet to the fire around how this stuff rules out. So Ms. Williams, we can make sure your school's on the list of where a highly qualified reading coach goes, for example. Another thing that I heard us say is that it's, even though the bill's passed, the fight's not over, and we need to keep the pressure up on our lawmakers to fix the problems we see in the bill and to fund the programs that were left out of the bill, whether that be special education or pre-K or any of the things that were bizarrely left out of an education reform bill. And to keep the focus on evidence. So we got to keep the pressure up on our lawmakers. I heard we need to watch the legal space, because there's a lot of lawyers looking at this, you know, sadly, the state of Arkansas has wasted an awful lot of time and money trying to defend the unconstitutional in years past, and hopefully we're not returning to those days on education. And then the last thing is something that you alluded to, Representative Garner, in terms of the fear of some of these legislators of being primaried out by Sarah Huckabee Sanders. But what I would say is I wore my favorite t-shirt today to remind everybody that ultimately we have to hold these folks accountable. And we have to vote. We have to make sure that our neighbors are informed about how this bill is going to hurt their local schools and their local kids. And and their community. And we have to make sure people hold these lawmakers accountable for the vote they just took. As Representative Wooten said, he thinks this vote's going to haunt a lot of those legislators. I know you all join me. I hope the bill works. I hope our education performs dramatically better. But all the evidence suggests that this bill is going to be a pretty big drag on our state's education system. And if it proves to be that way, the governor and these Republican lawmakers own our education system now. It's their education system, and we need to hold them accountable. So, any last words from either of you?
Yes, I would like to say something because I was actually a student under the former Huckabee during all of this Lakeview and the aftermath. And so I know Governor Sanders has said that she wants to be the education governor, but just want to remind her that's a bold statement. We know we've heard a lot about boldness coming out of this administration. So keep in mind that the students that will be matriculating through our systems will be the people of the future that will come back and, be commentators as to what happened to them. So if you're stepping out to say, hey, this is, excuse me. Sorry. I just want her to keep that in mind, that the students that are matriculating through our schools now will be the ones that will kind of give the referendum on her. Did she meet those goals, and did she educate them to the best of her ability? So that's kind of the last thing I want to say. Thank you.
Representative Garner, you get the last words.
I just want to say thank you to Special for everything that she's done and will continue to do. And to just say again that without Citizens First Congress and Public Policy Panel and all of you that work with the panel and support the panel, we could not do what we do without your support and without your help. So please continue to do that. Obviously, voting is wonderful and we want you to vote. But before we get to the polls and to election time, we need to educate the public about what's going on. Please tell your friends. Every teacher needs to talk to another teacher or someone else who doesn't have the time to pay attention. So many folks want to pay attention, but they're too busy with 2 or 3 jobs or whatever it is that's going on in their families, trying to figure out how to keep a roof over their heads or feed their children, whatever it is. We've got to educate the public. And then the other thing I'll say is please contact me. Let me know what I can do to help. Let me know, how I can run specific legislation or how I can get specialists into the committee to talk about these things that we need to be talking about. You let me know what I can do for you. That's what I'm here for. So thank you for having me. Thank you for the support the last 2 weeks and for the last 40 years I've been in Arkansas. So thank you. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you very much. And thanks for everybody tuning in today. Next Friday, we'll be back talking about more important issues moving through our legislature, impacting the state. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next Friday, if not sooner. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all.
Bye.